think it's recording. There's a cloud with a red dot. All right. Wow. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Welcome to today's presentation on practical pranayama for the modern magician. And the reason the unicorn is there is because when I asked the PowerPoint to recommend designs, the first one that came up was a unicorn, and I was like, damn Skippy, we're having a unicorn. So, welcome to Sekhet-Maat. If you are not currently a dues-paying member of Sekhet-Maat, we would sincerely appreciate your donation of $5 to $10 or $5,000 to $10,000, whatever you've got laying around, to help us keep our programs in place and to help expand the light of Thelema in the Valley of Portland, Oregon. So good science starts with observation. And today we will be discussing pranayama, which has been called the science of breath. So I invite you all to start off with my favorite yoga teacher cue. Take a comfortable seat. And the reason that's my favorite cue is that once someone tells you to get comfortable, it's impossible. So take a comfortable seat. I don't care whether you're on the floor or in a chair. If you're going to play along, I invite you to sit in such a way that your spine is more or less in good alignment. Maybe close your eyes and check to make sure your head is sitting on top of your spine. And then just for about 30 seconds, I'm going to invite you to observe your breath, not change it, not do anything about it, just observe it. If someone asked you what is happening, what words would you use them to describe what you are feeling? If you had to choose adjectives to describe the quality of your breath, what words would you choose? Please open your eyes. Class begins with a warning. I am not a medical expert. Other ideas besides mine actually do exist. You may be offended by this presentation. Be careful when you're driving, watch out for bicycles, don't run with scissors, wear a mask, and at all times, your mileage may vary. Now for some serious warnings, this class is going to include some pranayama practices that include kumbhaka or breath retention. If you have high blood pressure or low blood pressure, glaucoma or any medical condition involving eye pressure disorders, if you've had recent surgery, or if you have any medical condition that affects your intra-abdominal or intrathoracic cavity pressure, do not hold your breath under any circumstances, period. Don't do it. If you are pregnant, have epilepsy or a seizure disorder, or suffer from vertigo, you should speak to a doctor before holding your breath. So don't do it today. And everyone, just as a general reminder, don't ignore pain. Don't ignore the pain in your asana. Hey, that's actually funny. Don't ignore any pain in your seated position. Adjust or change so that you can not be in pain. Crowley, in some of his writings and in 8 lectures on yoga, talks about ignoring the pain in a sitting position. And he had some interesting ideas about what the purpose of that pain is. However, it is not anatomically necessary or anatomically friendly, and you can actually cause permanent damage to different parts of your body by holding a position that is unsuitable for your body at that particular moment. Do not strain or force your breath at any time. And if during any of our practices you begin to feel dizzy or lightheaded, please just drop out. Just stop doing it. Go back to normal breathing. You can imagine what the practice would be like in your head, but just go back to normal breathing because dizzy and lightheaded are not good signs. So before we begin talking about pranayama, a word about asana. First of all, the word is asana, not asana and not asana. Asana. The basic meaning of the word asana in Sanskrit is a seated position. Now, modern postural yoga uses it to describe everything, right? Warrior 2, tree pose. But in its historic meaning, it is a seated posture. And you'll see in some of the ancient yogic texts, it started to stray from that meaning based on the context that it's used in. But Asana means seated position. The only thing that Patanjali really had to say about asana was sthira sukham asanam. And this means the posture should be easy and steady, or gentle and steady, or effortless and easy. There's some argument as to whether Patanjali is speaking only to historical seated asanas, or if he had in mind some other kind of asana practice that is not documented in the Yoga Sutras. So your mileage may vary. Traditionally, pranayama was done while seated on the floor in a cross-legged position, with your spine in a neutral position, allowing free movement of your ribs, lungs, and diaphragm. Being seated cross-legged was symbolic of keeping the energy in towards yourself, the energy that you're generating, keeping it in close towards your body, as opposed to spreading it out. In the year 2020, we don't have a lot of humans that are used to sitting flat on the floor. So if you are practicing pranayama and seated on the floor, and you find that your low back is doing that thing where it curves backwards and you kind of start hunching over, grab some cushions or copies of Liber Abba, the big blue brick, or something else that's big and sturdy to elevate your hips. If you're able to elevate your hips above your knees, it will make it easier for your lower body to relax and your upper body to remain in a neutral position. It is also perfectly legit to use a chair. Most of us grew up sitting in chairs, whereas as these practices were developing in India, most people grew up squatting or sitting on the floor. So it's a very different, we have very different bodies these days. There are also a number of pranayama practices where a supine or laying on your back position on the floor is appropriate. The danger there for me is always that I'm going to fall asleep. So if you choose to take a pranayama practice where you're laying on the floor, just be aware that's a hazard. Again, don't ignore pain at any time in the position that you're sitting in. There's a difference between that's a little uncomfortable and that hurts. But when you get to that position where, your foot has gone numb because you're cutting off the blood circulation, please consider that pain and adjust yourself. All right, a few preliminary matters. I apologize to those of you who joined us earlier at Star Sapphire. There are very few things repeated here. First of all, as you may know, Aleister Crowley wrote some stuff on yoga. We're not talking about it today. Specifically, he wrote Liber E, which is a treatise on magical practice, published in 1909. In 1910, he published Part 4 of the Temple of Solomon the King. This documents his yoga practice when he was studying in Sri Lanka, which was then Ceylon, with Alan Bennett, who had taken vows and was a Buddhist monk at the time. This section of the Equinox, Volume 1, issue number 4, was particularly interesting for me to read through because it shows a lot of Crowley's thinking about what he is learning about Indian tradition. And by that, I mean, he tries to lay out a basic primer for his readers who don't have any experience with Buddhism, with Hinduism, or with any kind of yoga at all whatsoever. And you can see some of his biases and what he thinks are important and are not important based on what he has written and what he has left out. And the next year, so we have 1909, 1910, 1911, he churned out Book 4, Part 1, which is part of Liber Abba, right, the big blue brick. There's a section in there on pranayama and mantra yoga where he equates the two. I think he's wrong, whatever. We're not talking about it today. And then finally in 1937, he delivered the 8 lectures that would go on to become the publication 8 Lectures on Yoga. We're not going to discuss any of the source texts today really either, but just to give you some historical timeline information. Between 500 BCE and 300 Common Era is when the material that is in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali was originally developed. When people talk about the Yoga Sutras, these are the Yoga Sutras they mean. For a variety of reasons, the Yoga Sutras have become one of the primary texts that are used in Western yoga. However, the Yoga Sutras are not considered the be-all, end-all in India, and in a lot of lineage yoga schools, they're considered pretty useless. Patanjali is the source of the 8 limbs of yoga. So the yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dhyana, I'm missing one, samadhi. Those 8 limbs come from Patanjali. About 1,000 years later, the material that ended up in the Shiva Samhita was published. This document was developed sometime between 1300 and 1500 of the Common Era. So you can think about what was going on in the rest of the world in the 13 to 1500s. Not a And this material was published by one individual. Dan, was that a question? I can see a few people, but not all of you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you know specifically what the difference is between the Samhita and the Sanhita is?
Same thing. The difference, so in some, just like any language where the primary character set is not a Western character set, the ABC alphabet, there are multiple ways that you can write it in the ABC character set. So for example, in Chinese, there are 2 or 3 different systems of writing the Chinese characters in English letters. So you get Peking and Beijing, but they're the same. They're just pronounced a little differently. It's the same thing with Sanskrit, depending on which author you're using. They'll either have an N with a little dot under it, which I couldn't make happen on my computer. I could make a check mark, but not a dot. So I went with the M for Samhita, but that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Following the beginning of the creation of the Shiva Samhita is when the Hatha Yoga Pradipika came out. That text is often mentioned in a footnote in modern yoga teacher training classes because it is another compendium of yoga practices. And it's still developed in the era when the body was considered a bad thing you were trying to liberate yourself from. Like the body's kind of a bag of water and pus and goo. And so it always needed to be clean because everything about it's dirty, right? So there are a lot of practices in there that are contrary to any kind of, I don't know, sense of being sanitary or any sense of like actually taking care of your body based on what we know on modern science. And so while it's an interesting text to read in the context of the development of yoga practice, and it does treat pranayama, I highly recommend against pretty much every physical practice it mentions except for the asanas. Finally, the last of these texts from the 16 to 1700s was the Garanda Samhita. This is another text that we know that Crowley had access to because he footnotes things and drops names like a fiend. So he's got references to this in the Temple of Solomon. Right, so before we talk about pranayama, let's have a few words of Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit is considered a sacred language. It was not developed as a spoken language. It was, according to tradition, it was received by the rishis, who were like the old dude sages, who just sort of sat around and in their wisdom, the universe spoke to them and conveyed all of this knowledge. And one of the things the universe conveyed was the Sanskrit language. Now, Sanskrit is a fairly complicated language in that the words take their meaning from the words that are sitting around them. And anytime you need to describe a new thing, you take the root meanings of different words, and you just hook them together. So in a way, like English needs to borrow words, or you hear people on television speaking another language and they like drop an English bomb in there. Sanskrit doesn't need to do that. It's a difficult language to learn because of the grammar, but the grammar is what gives the words meaning. So any translation is only as good as the translator. And what did I do with the quote? Oh, sorry. This is like one of my favorite quotes of all time. My friend and teacher, Douglas Brooks, he's a professor in New York. He says, in Sanskrit, any word means itself, its opposite, an elephant, a Brahmin, and a king. So part of the fun of Sanskrit is that the sound itself actually matters, and that the meanings are very difficult to tie down. So here we have the word yoga, and you've probably been told a bajillion zillion times that yoga means union. Well, sort of. Literally, the word yuj, which is the root, means yoke, like the physical thing that hooks the oxen to the cart or hooks the horses to the chariot. But it's a really generic word, kind of like the word thing is a generic word. Bring me that thing. The thing over there, the thingamajig, the who's what's it's the, doodlebug. So the word yoga doesn't only mean yoke. And just like in modern dictionaries, Sanskrit dictionaries list the meanings of a word based on those that are in most common usage. So the word yoga also means things like to string a bow, like a hunting bow, right? Or to outfit an army. So there are all these different words, all these different equivalents to the word yoga. And the word meditation does not show up until about halfway through the first page of a multi-page set of definitions. So recently I went to a webinar where the PhD instructor encouraged us to think about the word yoga and yoke as being based on the technology of the time. Chariots were the thing. That was high tech. And so if you look at even in the classical world, or what we think of as the Western classical world, the Greeks and Romans, there are a lot of references to chariots because like people get chariots, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. We got one already. But if you think about this in terms of maybe something slightly more modern, so this particular professor pumped this forward to rigging on a yacht or on a big like sailing ship, the cargo ship, right? Rigging, it has a lot of meanings as well, but it's a slightly more advanced technology, right? But it could also mean a physical thing. It can mean all the ropes and the stuff that is the rigging. It can mean the act of doing the rigging, but it also has meanings that are aside from the ship. So for example, with rigging, right, you can use the word rig as a fraudulent thing too, right? Like you can rig an election or rig the results or rig the outcome or whatever. So this professor invited us to imagine that there's a spiritual practice called rigging, right? And it looks a lot like yoga. And, you know, rigging is something that you do to get ready to like do the inner work. And so in the modern age, people go to these small studios to do these physical activities to like rig their body up, right? To get ready to do the work. So the question is then, what are you rigging or yoking to? Now, if yoga means union, the goal of all these systems of practice should be that the practice leads you to unite. But if you look at something like the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali's writing, right, the 8 limbs, you're fine-tuning your mind by trying to like untangle the internal rigging in order to separate yourself from the meat suit that you live in and this, you know, world of what they call Maya, of illusion. The idea is in Patanjali's yoga, you want to kind of get over your fat self and all of this bad self, get over your bad self and all this, and then, you know, move on to doing the real thing. So the practice isn't about uniting, it's about disuniting. Now, if you look at a text like the Bhagavad Gita, which focuses on yoga of devotion and on doing your dharma, which we Thelemites might think of as your true will, right? The reason you're here, the thing you were born to do, that one thing that you will truly that no one else does, right? In the Gita, those practices unite your inner self with God or the highest or, you know, the universe, whichever word you like to use. So let's move on to talk about prana. Now, there is no equivalent word in English. Roughly, it means vital life force. And a lot of people think of prana as breath. It comes from 2 roots. The root pra means to fill. And because of the way Sanskrit grammar operates, putting it at the beginning of the word means to constantly fill. And an is a word for movement. So prana is something that fills you or fills a thing with constant movement. So I asked in a similar class covering different material earlier today, why is it that we associate the breath with vital life force? Any takers? Like, why does breath mean life?
If you're not breathing, you're not living.
If you're not breathing, you're probably dead, right? How do you know that the baby's alive when it's born?
It's crying.
Right? And in order to cry, you have to breathe. So if we're looking back to a society that doesn't have the kind of science that we have and is living in the world based on observation, right? If you have 2 cats in front of you, the one that is breathing is the one that's alive. The one that is not breathing is the one that's not alive. So at least in terms of humans and animals, breath is the proof that it has prana. Now, historically, prana means bigger things than that. It's not just breath, because plants have prana. And this is before photosynthesis theories and all of that science were developed. So anything that's growing has prana. Sunlight has prana. Clean water has prana. And food has prana. And interestingly, in some of the traditions, they teach that leftover food or recooked food, or especially the ones that are like super vegetarian, vegan people, that meat has like negative prana. So you have to, avoid that if you don't want to like have prana sucked out of you. But you can kind of get the idea of like an ear of corn picked off a stalk has more life force to it than, tortilla chips. Fair enough? All right. So I like this quote from Swami Vivekananda for a couple of reasons. One is that we know Crowley read Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. But another is that this gives the idea of two things as making up the universe, akasha and prana, and they're both infinite. The akasha is the material of the universe, the stuff it's made of, and the prana is the manifesting power of the universe. So if you're familiar with Indian cosmology, this is the Shiva Shakti in play, right? Shiva is all the potential, and Shakti is the thing that makes the potential happen. And in the thelemic system, you can think of this as being Nuit and Hadit. We have the gender slightly reversed, so that Nuit is all things that possibly could be, right? Empty space, no division between anything, all the possible everythings. And it is Hadit that is a single point or a place that allows reference and that allows that manifestation. So pranayama has typically been translated as breath control. I do not like this definition at all whatsoever, but here's where the logic is. Pranayama can be broken down into the root word prana, which we've just discussed, and the word yama. Now, the yamas are the first branch of Patanjali's yoga, and yama effectively means restraint. The list of yamas are like the thou shalt nots of the traditional yoga culture, or the culture that yoga developed in. So yama is something that asks you to exercise some restraint or some control over whatever the thing is. So to say that to yama your prana is to control your prana, or to manage your, or somehow keep it from getting to like refrain yourself from like pushing it out there, like keep it here. Now, this isn't an incorrect definition, because remember, the way that Sanskrit works is how you use a word in context, or the context of the word, the grammar of all of that helps you to figure out what the word means. So there are words that have many meanings. Remember, itself, its opposite, an elephant, a Brahmin, and a king. So another way to break down pranayama is to break it down into pran, which is one of the root, pran is one of the roots of prana, and the word ayama. Now, when you add a as a prefix, it acts as a negator. So instead of yama-ing something, right, trying to restrain it or restrict it or make it small, if we are going to ayama it, we're going to elongate it or lengthen it or like stretch it out. So in this sense, pranayama is breath extension. And one of the reasons that I like this definition is because and I should have prefaced this in the beginning with, there are a lot of things that I'm going to have to grossly oversimplify. So when I say like in the yoga tradition, as if there's just one, there's not. But for simplicity, I'm like packing it all into this gross oversimplification. Like Americans like candy, okay? So in the yoga tradition, there was this idea that your life is measured in breaths. And if you use up your breaths early, you die young. So if you can extend your breath and make it longer so that you don't need as many of them per minute or hour or day, you are lengthening the time that you have in this body on this existence to do the spiritual work that you're here to do. So I like that reason for a breath extension as pranayama, but also because a lot of the practices, and if you read Crowley, you'll see his whole focus is on make the breath as slow as possible. In other words, like draw it out, extend it out. All right, are there any questions so far? Comments?
I do have a comment from way at the beginning.
Yeah.
There was a thing when you were talking about like observing the breath, when you were kind of asking everyone to observe their breath. And we just like rewatched a talk from Thelemic, and it kind of clicked with me. It was like one of the comments one of the speakers gave was that when we observe something in a scientific experiment, we oftentimes are changing that thing. So matter or molecules or breath or whatever, once you put your attention or focus towards that thing, it changes and becomes different. And so it's just like really interesting now that I've heard observe the breath so many times, but in this time today, I've heard it and I'm like, observing the breath is going to start changing my breath, which is going to start changing me, which is going to start moving things in a different direction, and I have to write it down and I got to keep track and make sure I notice any changes, and just kind of like it's just kind of like the waterfall of getting into magical practice, and being able to take those little bits and pieces and everything comes together and just kind of makes sense all of a sudden. So I don't know. I just wanted to comment about that.
Anybody else notice when you were observing your breath that it was very hard not to make changes and to just watch?
That's the first thing I wanted to do, was adjust my breath.
See, right? Common experience. So why do we do pranayama? To what end? Well, good science uses experiments. So we've done an observational experiment. So now we're going to do a different experiment. So once again, I would invite you to make yourself comfortable. If you have your hands on anything, set those things down. Either put your hands in your lap or put them on your thighs. Close your eyes for a moment. Notice that each time you exhale, your diaphragm muscle just underneath your rib cage moves into your body and a little bit up to press your lungs up. On your next exhale, try making it sharp and deliberate so that you pull your diaphragm in, like, and it will shoot the air out your nose. Inhale normally, and then try again with that exhale to shoot it out your nose. Now, following your cycle of breath, I'm going to give you 30 seconds on my clock. What I would like you to try is, as you exhale with that forceful pulling in of your diaphragm to push it out your nose, but let the inhale come by itself. So you have 30 seconds. And if you're finding this easy, you can try speeding it up so that you are exhaling more rapidly. Just allow the inhale to come, but push the air out with your diaphragm. Those are your 30 seconds. Now, let your breath return to normal and observe how you feel. What impact did that breathing pattern have on your body? When you're ready, open your eyes. And if you would like to share, I would love to know what your experience is just with 30 seconds of that pranayama. What change did it make in your thoughts, feelings, emotions, body?
It produces heat right away.
Good observation.
It kind of energizes your mind, like stimulates the frontal cortex.
Oops.
Yeah.
This isn't the right slide for this.
One of the things I noticed was that kind of like that energization, and then the feeling of like from the in to the out vibrating, like, so like my little layers are vibrating from the inside out. So interesting.
Does anyone else have an observation they'd like to share?
I felt like everything got a little bit quieter, like my thoughts as well.
Mm-hmm. Did you find it hard to think about moving your diaphragm and making it go while holding other thoughts in your head?
Yes, most definitely.
Anyone else? All right. Well, as I had pointed out, the next slide is not the slide for what we just did, so we're going to come back to it. But eventually we'll hit the slide for what we just did, and I'll explain a little bit more. However, that practice that you just practiced is called Kapalabhati. It means breath of fire or skull shining breath. And one of the purposes in using that pranayama, it is used historically as a body purifier. It actually forces more air out of your lungs so that you get fresh air into the depths of your lungs, but also to generate heat. And so if you are in a situation where you are needing to generate that internal kind of heat for any reason, Kapalabhati is a very practical tool to have in your toolbox. There will be written instructions later in a slide that we're going to get to soon. So let's talk about anatomy, right? Since we're talking about modern magicians, we have the benefit of modern anatomy. Now, this is Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson from 1632. And this is sort of the beginning of what I would call modern medicine, right? We're not just talking about the four humors and, letting blood exclusively or drilling holes in your head to try to fix what ails you. When people die, we can cut them up and find out, like, gosh, that thing over there looks lumpier than it did on the last guy, or like that thing, is too small. The other guy's was much bigger. Like, why is that? And we start to get some knowledge that's based on, looking at corpses and bodies and science. And we start to bring in a little chemistry and a little biochemistry. I'm not saying it happened all at once, because God knows it took us a long time to get there, right? They were still bleeding people in the colonies in 1776, but, we got there eventually. So here's the human spine. I couldn't find a great picture of just a spine. They all sort of looked lousy. So you're going to have to pretend this is a great spine. What I really want you to look at here are that there are three natural curves in the body, right? There's one that's that low back curve that kind of curves into your body. And most of us, when we're in lousy posture and slump forward, it's curving back out of the body. So that curve in, and then notice on the upper back, kind of behind your shoulders, there's a curve out. And then also the third curve that's right up at the base of your neck curves into the body. Now, I don't know if this will work. Let me see if I can do this sideways. There's a tendency in modern life to hold your head forward, so that instead of having your head on your spine, it's like doing this, or, you're texting. And if you drop your head and pretend for a moment that you're on a phone, you'll notice that what happens to that curve in the back of your neck is it completely flattens out. So we now have two curves that I can point to as definitely abusing, right? One being when you lose that lumbar curve in your low back by hunching forward, and one when you're looking at your text or your computer. And you can make it even worse by imagining that you're on a keyboard that's a little bit in front of you. So you're looking forward at the computer, and now I've got flat back of my head, super rounded upper back, and super rounded lower back. Like I'm one big giant C curve with a flat. When you're practicing pranayama, one of the reasons that you want to sit with your spine in an anatomically happy position, lower curve in, upper curve out, little curve in your neck, so head like on your spine, not, doing this, so that your lungs have some unrestrained movement and the rest of your body can sit for long periods of time. Now, if you're not used to sitting, or you're not used to sitting well, this will tax your abs and your low back as you start to learn to do it. So be careful and be kind to your body. The rib cage is also an important element of pranayama. I don't know how much you guys know about ribs, but basically the top bits of your ribs are connected to your sternum, which is that nice hard bone right in the middle. Next section of ribs are not connected to bone, but they're connected to the cartilage of the next rib over. And then the very bottom ribs are only attached on the back. Now, part of the reason that your upper back curve has less mobility, like you can do a lot of like pretty serious wavy stuff with your low back, but you can't with your upper back. And part of that is because of the attachments of your ribs. Now, when you breathe, breathing actually changes the shape of your thoracic cavity, of that chest cavity, because as your lungs expand, they get more capacity and the diaphragm drops. In fact, oh, it's not the next slide. We're going to talk about the diaphragm in a second. That'll hopefully make more sense. But for now, rib cage, thoracic cavity, both increases in size and increases in capacity. Your lungs, I like this because it looks like a little tree. Fun fact, your right lung is bigger than the right one. Right lung is bigger than the left one. Your right lung has 3 lobes and your left lung has 2. And the yogis had no idea this was the case, but it makes sense because your heart has to go somewhere. So if you're cramming your heart into the left side of your body cavity, the lung that's going to be around it has to take up less space. Now, one of the reasons I find this interesting is because the right side of the body and the right nostril are associated with the sun and masculine energy, and the left nostril and the left side of the body are associated with feminine and creative energy and lunar energy. And if you think about the generalized concepts, broad brushstroke here, of the sun and the moon, right? The sun is often seen as the stronger force, and it now correlates to your right lung, which has 3 lobes. The diaphragm is sort of shaped like a parachute. This is a thin skeletal muscle, and it separates your thoracic or chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. The way that it works is when you are exhaling, it becomes parachute shaped and pushes up on your lungs, squishing the air out. Ordinarily, that portion of your breath happens kind of by itself, right? The diaphragm will come back to this like pushed out sort of neutral shape. When you inhale, that parachute flattens itself out to allow for the expansion of your lungs down into your rib cage. And then when you exhale again, it releases and the air can come back up. Now, I mentioned that earlier that in the chest cavity, when you inhale, you're increasing both your volume, total volume that you can hold, and you're increasing the size and shape of your thoracic cavity. Breathing changes the shape of your abdominal cavity, but does not change the volume. And that is because all of the air that comes into your body when you're breathing happens in the thoracic cavity. It happens essentially above the diaphragm. So all that happens in that breathing action is your diaphragm kind of massages the organs that are below it, right? It goes from being the parachute shape to, kind of pressing down, and then it floats back up to press the air out, comes back down to let the air in, gives your inner organs a little massage as it goes along. So the main breathing muscle is the diaphragm. That's why it got its own slide. There are, however, a number of other muscles that assist with respiration. And if you have a weak diaphragm or have certain medical issues, you will use those accessory muscles to breathe more than you will use your diaphragm, or you will overtax them. Kind of like if you can't use your left arm and your right arm has to do everything, your right arm gets a lot stronger. And then suddenly you have a little bitty left arm and a really big right arm. In general, accessory breathing is problematic and is dysfunctional breathing in terms of Western medical science. And this, if you think about this should sort of make sense to you, right? What we want to call the natural breath is sort of automatic. It's an automatic bodily function. You can control it, but you don't have to. It'll happen whether you think about it or not. The definition by Doug Keller, who's got a book that I highly recommend on pranayama, he calls natural breath the full, healthy, free, and uninhibited breath with which we were born. Now, your natural breath is affected by stress. It can be affected by clothing, think corsets, or even just tight clothing. It can be affected by your posture, and it can be affected by the environment. So if you were in a room of people who all have a similar breathing pattern going on, you will adopt it unconsciously without knowing. This is kind of how stress spreads, right? You walk into a room and you have that stereotypical like tension you could cut with a knife. Everyone there, their breathing is affected by stress. It's essentially going to get you too. Sort of like when somebody yawns, suddenly there's a rash of yawns and no one can stop them. The natural breath pattern is to inhale through the nose only. Your diaphragm drops down for the lungs to expand. The top, middle, bottom of your lungs fill up. Your ribs expand outward. Your sternum rises up. And as you exhale, your sternum drops down, your rib cage contracts gently, your diaphragm relaxes back down. A natural breath has a kind of wave-like quality. This has been described as the feeling of being breathed, right? The breath just does its thing and you're around for the ride. Natural breath has also been described as rhythmic, calm, and regular, with the exhalation just a little tiny bit longer than the inhalation. And natural breath is generally effortless. Now, I spent all this time talking about natural breath because now we're going to talk about unnatural breath or defective breathing patterns. Defective breathing patterns include lots and lots of things. So they might be, for example, regularly inhaling through the nose and the mouth instead of the nose, or regularly inhaling just through your mouth. That particular pattern has some obvious problems. Your mouth dries out. You don't end up with the same protection that you get from the little hairs in your nose that filter out the bad stuff that you breathe in. And you may end up with some bad breath because of that. And because the air is not as well moistened or as consistently moistened, that also affects the gas exchange in the rest of your body. Another broad category of these defective breathing patterns is overbreath. And overbreathing is not exactly hyperventilating. Overbreathing is the overuse of your accessory muscles generally. And the amount of oxygen that you breathe in and the carbon dioxide that you breathe out are not in balance with your body's actual needs. Now, why is this a problem? Well, first of all, chronic stress can lead to that becoming a habit where you're constantly overbreathing. And this means that you're not providing your body with the food, air, water, and sunlight that it needs to grow, right? You're screwing up on the water parts or the air parts. So you're not going to have the same results that you'd have if you were meeting your oxygen needs properly. There are a bunch of medical articles actually that deal with disorders that are based solely on breathing. And by disorder, I don't mean like a body part that is not formed correctly or a disease. I mean just like the misuse of the parts that you've got. So just for fun, I thought I'd throw some of these out here, some actual science. This is from Doug Keller's book, Refining the Breath, which is in the slides at the end. Hyperventilation syndrome. All right, this is called a prevalent breathing pattern disorder. Hyperventilation syndrome is common among adults. It's about 6 to 10%. In one study they did, 8% of the patients who had no history of asthma demonstrated the presence of hyperventilation. It's like a compensatory mechanism in some ways. Dysfunctional breathing is 7 times more prevalent in women than in men. Between 1950 and 1975, the Mayo Clinic noted that the greatest number of cases of hyperventilation, that's the, right, that you're associating with hyperventilation. The vast majority happened in 13 to 15-year-old children with no difference between boys and girls. And if you think about what the 13 to 15-year-olds ages are like and what kinds of stress you're under, both from your body changing and from society expectations and from middle school and high school or death and, all those kinds of things, it makes sense that that population might be extra subject to having stress affect their breathing patterns. Another study from Vancouver, Canada, showed that 26.9%, so over 25, not to 30, 26.9% of children with a diagnosis of exercise-induced asthma, in fact, had exercise-induced hyperventilation and not asthma. And then here's just a quote kind of describing it. Hyperventilation is essentially a bad habit. A habit of breathing in such a way that the day-to-day level of carbon dioxide is relatively low. Given this basic bad habit, any physical or emotional disturbance may trigger off a chain reaction of increased ventilation, rapidly producing hypocapnic symptoms, alarm engendered by the symptoms, consequent sympathetic arousal resulting in increased ventilation and increasing symptoms. In other words, it creates a feedback loop. This trigger sets off the faster breathing, which then you go, oh shit, my body's doing this thing. And then that stress triggers it and so on in the cycle. Does that all make sense? Da, 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 da. Accessory breathing, that is using these muscles that are not supposed to be the prime mover, so not the diaphragm, but the sternocleidomastoid, which kind of goes from the back of your skull down to the front of your sternum, or the intercostal muscles that are between the ribs. So there's some like little baby ones here and then some bigger ones in the front. Using these muscles too much can cause nerve damage. It can annoy your nerves and cause headaches. I mean, think about what happens if these muscles here tighten themselves up into little knots because they're being overused, right? That pulls on the back of your head and you get that like tension headache action. This breathing pattern also causes too much carbon dioxide breathed out, so it lowers the acidity of your blood, which makes it become too alkaline. So your body is now looking for acids to balance your blood out. That in and of itself can lead to emotions of anxiety. Physically, it can lead to oversensitivity of the nerve endings, which will also increase the level of histamines in your blood, which means that your allergic reaction to something is going to go through the roof. And the excessive alkalinity in the blood can also cause the smooth muscles that are around the blood vessels, what helps to pump, to squeeze that blood through your blood system, can make them tighter. And so because they're tighter and harder, that reduces the blood flow to your brain and your muscles, which sends signals to your brain that you're not getting enough blood, which tells your heart to pump harder, which leads to high blood pressure because those vessels are so tight. So all of this is to say that breathing is no joke, pranayama is no joke, but it's a really cool tool. So, pop quiz. What is the difference between respiration, digestion, and circulation? Why is respiration different? Any takers? What makes respiration special?
It's the thing that makes all the other things work.
Bingo. If you mess with your digestion, you're still going to probably be okay on the circulatory side. You're probably not going to be feeling great, but your nervous system's not going to go nuts, and you can still breathe. But if you mess with your respiration, everything else tumbles like a stack of dominoes. Right. So this is the experiment that we did earlier. So let's talk about that one first. Kapalabhati breathing. That's that short, sharp exhale of forcing your diaphragm in. It comes from the word kapala, so the emphasis is on the second A, kapala, which means skull, and the word bhati, which means shining or illuminating. Because it produces heat, it is also sometimes called the breath of fire. Now, I was taught this as a pranayama technique, but it is also referred to as a kriya, which is a cleansing technique, or a shat karma. And the shat karmas were taught in the Samhita and the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as bodily cleansing techniques. Again, I'm living in a bag of goo. I need to clean it out. Okay. So I'm going to substitute here what was going to be the original practice that I thought we were doing the first time. So let's have another experiment. If you're game, take a comfortable seat, set your things down, put your hands in your lap or on your thighs, close your eyes. Take a big inhalation through your nose, and as you exhale, open your mouth and pretend you're fogging up a mirror. Do that a few more times and see if you can make a sound so that you have that inhale through your nose and the exhale through your mouth. And as you make that exhale through your mouth, notice what the back of your throat and the back of your mouth are doing. And the next time you have to exhale, do the same thing, but with your mouth closed, so you're forcing the air out of your nose. So you'll still feel some tightness in the back of your throat and maybe hear a fogging sound or a hissing sound as that breath comes through your nose. And for 30 seconds, continue to inhale through your nose and then fog that mirror up through your nose as you exhale. When you're ready, return your breathing to normal and open your eyes again. I'm going to trace us back to the slide on Ujjayi breathing. This breath is made, or this word is made up of ud and ji, and the two words together mean to be victorious. So this is sometimes referred to as victorious breath. Did anyone notice anything interesting while trying out this breathing, or have an observation about what happened to your body while you were doing it?
I wanted to ask, is it normal can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask, is it normal to feel a pinching sensation in my throat? It was kind of like not quite painful, but almost.
Try, next time you try, relax that a little bit. So pinching is usually like super tight muscle, like let it go a little. You're trying to fog it up, but the mirror's really close to your face. It doesn't have, you're not shooting, far away, like just like,
Okay.
see if that helps to relax a little bit. Anybody else? Questions, comments, observations?
Feels more like a cooling breath.
Definitely more cooling than Kapalabhati, that's for sure.
I definitely felt like moisture coming into my face.
Mhm.
So like what was really dry is now feels kind of like lubricated
Mhm.
in a way. So and I went because Dan was saying the cooling breath. I've done this before in a trauma focused yoga
Mhm.
practice where you breathe in through the teeth
Mhm.
and out through the nose. And that like creates the cooling effect. Is that is there a name for
We're
that?
going there.
Okay.
We're going there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
No, it's cool. I love it when you see my evil plan in advance. So this breath can also be done, it's often done in classes that are movement yoga classes, like a modern postural yoga, as we call it. So you might inhale, arms up, exhale, fold forward kind of thing. When you're using this Ujjayi breath as a pranayama practice, one of the things that you can add is a quick retention, just a short one between each inhale and exhale. So you might ordinarily have whereas with the retention you'd have so if you are a person who does not have high blood pressure, low blood pressure, glaucoma, recent surgery, all the things I listed at the beginning, and you would like to give this a try, we'll do that for 30-ish seconds. So if you are not a breath holding person, don't hold your breath. You can either opt out or breathe in, breathe out on the Ujjayi breathing. So once again, allow yourself to chill out, close your eyes, and then inhale through your nose. When you're finished with your full inhale, pause for a second or two, and then let the breath out through your nose with that hissing sound. That's a little over 30 seconds. So release your hold on your breath. Let it go back to doing its thing when you're ready. And then open your eyes back up. For those who played with that kumbhaka, that moment of retention, did you feel a difference between the practice you just did with the retention and the one that you did without the retention?
One thing I felt was kind of like a warmth here at the top of the front part of my head.
Mhm.
That wasn't quite there before. It was more like I could feel just like the moisture coming back into my sinus cavity, but this time I could feel like a warmth here on the top of the front of my head.
Did anyone else notice a difference in the two practices? I know this is just like I'm giving you, a tiny baby bite of each and then asking you to compare, but
Well,
it's what we've got.
when I do my retention either direction, that's when I have a small moment of silence in my mind as well.
Mhm.
Like when I don't think about the breath or anything, it's just that is my little silent time, and then it comes back, and then I breathe out, and then it's a silent time. So
Mhm.
trying to extend that goes with the slowing down of the breath as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Anyone else want to share? Okay. So again, this practice can be used with modern postural yoga, but it can also be used as a standalone, only you're sitting, so it's like a sit-alone practice. One of the things that I've personally noticed as I've engaged with this practice is that when I first started doing it, I was with a teacher who was counting out loud, and we were retaining the breath for 4 of her counts. And I always felt like I was going to die before the number 4. Like if I didn't exhale by 3, like everything was going to explode. And so what I would recommend if you are able to safely practice that breath retention is instead of counting, start with what feels perfectly natural to hold, and then try adding like a little tiny eyelash of time onto that, and maybe a little tiny eyelash of time onto that. The idea when you're increasing these times, if you read some of the things Crowley's written, he's like, do 15 seconds, then do 30, then do a minute. And I'm like, whoa, Crowley. You need to gradually build up to these things, because each time you change, and each time I've asked you to change your breath, it's had an impact on your nervous system, whether you realize it or not. And I can only see a few of you at a time, but from the nodding of heads and the responses that I'm getting, I know that at least some of you are feeling that effect. It can be a little subtle to start with, so if you're not on board yet, don't worry. But never put yourself in a position where you feel like you're going to explode, or where you feel you start to feel panicky. Because if you're like, no, I've just got to get to that 4-second hold, it's going to start to press on your nervous system in uncomfortable ways that may leave you feeling mentally jarred, or at least not in a pleasant position for the end of your practice. Questions, comments, rude remarks before I move on to the next section? All right, so we're going to jump back ahead, because remember I messed those 2 slides up. All right, why do we do pranayama? The old yogis back in the day were trying to live as long as possible. Like eternal life meant taking 1 breath a day kind of thing. We've sort of figured out that maybe we don't want to live forever, or maybe how many breaths we take has nothing to do with how long we live, because you breathe more when you exercise, and exercise is correlated with longevity. So like maybe the number of breaths doesn't go with how long I get to live. So another thing we're not looking for is necessarily cleansing and purification, right? We're Thelemites. We're embodied beings. We live in the world, and we are entitled to take our fill of pleasure in all of the glorious things there are in the world. We're not ascetics who believe in shutting ourselves off from all this. So we also don't think that the body is some dirty, horrible bag of pus that needs to be purified. So this isn't the answer either. I would point to Libre Libre, the book of the balance. And if you look at this, sorry, I have to move you guys, you're over my text. Ooh. If you look at this first verse, right? Know then that man is born into this world amidst the darkness of matter and the strife of contending forces. So must his first endeavor be to seek the light through their reconciliation. So personally for me, your mileage may vary, I find that pranayama practice is very helpful in balancing not just my breath with the inhale, the exhale, and the retention, taking various portions, but that calms my mind and brings me to a more even-keeled, reconciled place. Think about if you've ever been around somebody who's really upset, like if somebody's upset and they're crying, like what's one of the first things that somebody will say?
Are you okay?
Okay, are you okay? Are you okay? And they're like, oh, the world's terrible. Okay, so like what's something else that's really common that people will say? What do you tell them to do?
Take a breath.
Take a breath. Take a deep breath, right? Because if you're in that emotional, like think back to a time when you've been really upset about something, whether you're crying or sobbing or, just really, really upset, and think about what your breath was like at that moment, or think about how your body felt. Maybe you don't remember what your breath was doing, but can you think about how your body felt when you were in that like really panicked, upset, or angry, or, hurt and mad about it? Like the breath in that situation tends to do like the quick, fast, short thing, pumping lots of oxygen out so that you can run away from that tiger. Sometimes you need that, right? If you're running from a tiger, good to have that breath. But if it's just that, your boss just yelled at you and you're having a bad day at work, I have found that taking some time to breathe will help me balance myself back out, which physically calms my nervous system and then mentally puts me in a better place to move forward. So for me, this is one way to reconcile competing forces within myself physically, and then also nervous system and mentally. Another reason why we might do these things, in Aleister Crowley's magical and philosophical commentaries on the Book of the Law, and by the way, this is one of the graphics I got when I searched for mastery, so hence we get that. The way of mastery is to break all the rules, but you have to know them perfectly before you can do this. Otherwise, you are not in a position to transcend them. So when I was in high school, I was kind of a goody two-shoes. I know you're all shocked. And one day I skipped class. We had an exam. It was kind of a big deal. And I totally got away with it. My brother, who skipped class all the time and was always getting busted, was really pissed. This is not fair. You got to make up that exam and whatever, and I just missed one class and I've got detention. Look, you have to understand the rules of the system and the way things work before you can mess with them. I understand the system works. I've transcended it. Now I can skip class when I want to. You, on the other hand, haven't figured it out. So I would say that pranayama is a means to self-mastery because, and I reused the same slide for a reason, because being able to make a decision about what your respiratory system is going to do will have an impact on what your digestive system is going to do. So you can't just sit here and say, stomach, digest harder. Or like, I don't want to eat again today. Can we just like hold the breakfast there and make it stop? You don't have that control. But you do have control over your breathing. And your breathing has an impact on your digestive system functioning well. Dysfunctional breathing, dysfunctional digestive system, right? When you're getting ready to chase the tiger, you throw up because your body's like, no time to digest, got to move the blood to the legs so I can run. So if you're in that, oh my God, I feel like I'm getting chased by a tiger thing right after breakfast, chances the breakfast is going to sit well with you, not so good. But if you can bring yourself back to that place of equanimity and balance with your breath, more likely that your tummy is going to calm down. A little ginger tea never hurts either, but I'm all for using all the tools in the toolkit. So let's talk a little bit about the nervous system, since I keep mentioning it. The human nervous system is an integrated system. So unlike, say, the digestive system, where you could talk about the stomach does this part of the process and the liver does that part of the process, the human nervous system is kind of all together. And so we can only sort of chop it up artificially. The nervous system monitors not just your control and communication internally, but it also affects your communication and control externally. If you have a lot of nerves, right, or if you have nerve damage, you might find yourself shaking. Like think about when you get really emotional about something. 3 major functions are to gather information, then your brain processes that information, and your body responds to that information. So your nervous system has a direct effect on what you sense, like how hot, how cold does it feel, on your sleep, on your digestion, on your circulation, your mood, how tired you are. Basically, your entire physical body gets signals from the nervous system telling you what to do. And you can break this down into two pieces. The central nervous system, you probably all studied in school. There's a brain, there's a spinal cord. You know what your brain does. Your spinal cord sends the messages up and down like little electrical bits. The nerve in your arm goes, ouch. It sends a message up to your spine. It goes to your brain goes, ouch. Now, what should I do next? And that part of your system functions as homeostasis central, right? There's a certain range of blood pressure that is healthy for a human being. There's a certain weight level that your body kind of wants to hang out at. There's a certain pH of your blood that if it gets too high or too low, you're going to die. So we better hang out in that like acceptable range. And your spinal cord and your brain are responsible for keeping all of those levels. They're like the engineer on the control deck fiddling with the knobs to make minor adjustments so that nothing explodes. The peripheral nervous system is absolutely everything else that isn't your spine and your brain. So there are two parts of that, or two categories of function that your peripheral nervous system handles. One is voluntary, which is sometimes called somatic, and the other one is involuntary, which is called autonomic. There is some overlap. For example, you know, if somebody comes at you with or throws something in your face, you're going to blink without thinking, but you can also think about it and go, oh yeah, I've been staring at the screen a while. I should blink, right? Within that autonomic, involuntary peripheral nervous system, there are two basic responses. This is gross oversimplification, okay? So the sympathetic is what we call your fight or flight. That's I'm being chased by a tiger. I need to get ready to run. Your blood pressure increases. This is supposed to be activated historically, right? Only in stressful situations where there is a perceived immediate danger that you need to get the hell away from or address right this second. When this happens, blood is directed away from your internal organs and out to, legs and arms, right? The opposite of fight and flight is the parasympathetic nervous system, or the relax and rest. This is where you want to be for the vast majority of your life, because this is like most of the time you're not being chased by a tiger. And so you don't really need to be ready to run away. Most of the time, you just want your nervous system to keep your breathing going the way it's supposed to, to take care of the waste products that your body needs pushed out, make sure that system's working well, digest all the things, and be like, we're just going to clean the house. It's all good, right? And this relax and rest is associated with a lower blood pressure, usually more stable. And blood is directed to the digestive system when there is food present. So if you eat breakfast and you're in this relax and renew state, it's going to digest as opposed to coming back out because your body thinks you're going to run away from a tiger. Now, the problem is that your body cannot tell the difference between stress from you're about to be chased by a tiger and stress from you're really upset about that presentation that you just gave that went like crap. So we have different kinds of stress that don't affect our immediate survival that are creating the same results physically that used to only be generated by help I'm being chased by a tiger. When you have a sympathetic, autonomic, involuntary peripheral nervous system that is overactive and you get chronic domination of this fight or flight response, you end up with high blood pressure because you're always ready to go. You end up with indigestion because your body's pumping all the blood away from your stomach all the time. You get backaches and heart arrhythmia and poor sleep, anxiety, depression, autoimmune disorders, lowered immunity, and death. This is not a good place to be permanently, my friends. That was supposed to be dramatic, but I realized that maybe it wasn't so dramatic. Maybe it was funnier in my head. I'm here for another half hour. Okay, so the chronic stress resets the parameters of your homeostasis. So if ordinarily, let's say healthy blood pressure for you is here, right? But you spend a lot of time in that stressed out fight or flight mode where your blood pressure is up here, homeostasis may reset to somewhere around here so that now, instead of hanging out in the healthy range during relax and renew time, it's hanging out up here. And that's just one example, but that stress affects all of these other things. So you may find that the homeostasis levels, instead of being where they're supposed to be, are like kind of out of whack. So let's see if I can get this one right. I know what I'll do. We're going to do another little experiment. So everyone close your eyes and I'll peek at the next slide to make sure I have the exercises in the right order. So take a moment, just close your eyes, get into that comfortable seat. You're not going to need your hands. If you are a person who can curl your tongue, you're going to curl your tongue and make like a little tube out of it. If you are a person who cannot curl your tongue, just let your mouth open slightly. You can either close your teeth or just keep your tongue away from your lips so that you have it's flat and on the base of your mouth. This time you're going to inhale either through that tube of a tongue or over a flat tongue. Let the air pass over your tongue, and as you exhale, exhale out your nose. I apologize that my cat is about to start meowing his head off, but for 30 seconds, ignore him as you inhale air over your tongue or through that tongue tube and exhale it out your nose. Don't worry about how long or short it is. Just let your breath do what it wants to do. In over the tongue, out through the nose. And when you're ready, probably want to lick your tongue in your mouth because it's a little dry from doing that. Let your breath go back to normal or do what it wants to do and open your eyes back up. So this type of pranayama is called sitali or sitali. Sorry, there should be an accent over that A, I believe, and the word sitali means cooling or soothing. So this is a way to slow your breath down because you're thinking about what you're doing, so it's probably going to be a little slower, but also bringing the air in over your tongue takes the moisture off of your tongue and cools your breath off a little bit. Did anyone notice that when the breath hit the back of your mouth, it felt a little cooler than the breath that comes in through your nose? Right? One of the functions of your nose is to warm your breath on the way in. So when you take your nose out of the equation, the air is cooler. Neat party trick if you're ever in a place where it's really hot. Same principle as dogs panting. But this is something that you can use also to reset your nervous system if you've done a couple of rounds of the Kapalabhati, that skull shining breath where you're going, right? This will help to calm your nervous system back down. Does anyone want to make some comments or share what you thought of this cooling pranayama?
I've done this practice before, and it's very like instantly feeling cool, especially when you're in like a hot situation where your temperature is really hot or you're feeling really hot from your environment. Is a great way to cool your core, your inner inside down, which kind of gets that like extra bit of relief, I feel.
If you have some ice cubes and you can cool your tongue down before you start the breathing, that will like double plus it.
Nice.
I mean, I know sometimes you don't have ice, but just something to play with. Anybody else have a thought they'd like to share?
I kind of found it interesting how anatomically odd it was. Like I had to really use my throat because usually I use my tongue so much more to block when I breathe out my nose, it just kind of rolls back and then makes the exhale easier. That one took more of a thought to use the throat before I could exhale properly out my nose. And by the end, it started doing it on its own. But at first, it took conscious thought, and that was kind of unique.
Good observation. Anyone else have a thought?
I'm just liking to hear everybody else's thoughts. It's food for thought for me, especially when you're commenting on the breathing and everything like that. It's helps me in my practice.
Excellent. I'm glad. So let's talk about yoga anatomy for a second. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we have modern anatomy. We don't really need yoga anatomy, but it can be helpful to understand a little bit of the basis on which some of these practices were developed. So imagine, if you will, you live in an era where there is no science, there is no medicine, and the only science you've got is the observations that you've got of your own body and what you can feel, touch, taste, like you hear a noise coming from over there. Okay, this is your life. You're living in a bag of goo, all right? The yogis thought of breath and of prana specifically as moving through channels they called nadis. Now, the word nadi also means like a tube or a river or a flow or a channel. Sometimes I've seen people try to say, oh, yeah, the nadis are blood vessels. Not really. The analogy is appealing because breath is what drives oxygen into your bloodstream, and it circulates through your, blood vessels, and that literally takes the oxygen through your body, and that keeps you alive and breathing. So it's prana related, right? But that's not what they were thinking of when the nadis were created. These were not necessarily thought of as like a thing that you'd be able to dig in there and find one, right? And there were said to be, 10,000 nadis and 72,000 nadis, and people get all excited about, oh, well, it's 72,000 and 72 in gematria is blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, hold your horses, yo. Because in yoga history and in yoga tradition, when you're writing about something, you might use a symbolic number, like if there's 3 or 5 or 7 or 8. But when you use a number like 10,000 or 72,000 or a million, it just really means a big number, like a lot. There's a lot. Don't count them. Big number. So when you see different texts talking about different numbers of nadis, they all use a really big number, and you can translate that as it's just a big number, okay? Don't get so excited. Now, if you've ever seen the caduceus, which is the staff of Mercury with the rod in the middle, and then there are snakes that kind of do this like curvy thing, that's sort of the idea of the 3 main nadis, which are known as Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. Now, the only reason the top row is purple is because I couldn't figure out how to change it. So don't get excited about Ida being the most exciting. It was supposed to be just, here are some things that we're going to talk about, okay? So Ida is associated with the left nostril. It is the feminine creative energy and also lunar energy. And remember, I mentioned earlier, your left lung only has 2 lobes. Pingala, which is the right nostril, right? That was said to lead to your Pingala nadi, is masculine and analytical and solar. 3 lobes on that side. If somebody wants to play with that math, I think it's kind of fun, 2 and 3, but like, okay, your mileage may vary. The central channel, right up and down the middle, was known as the Sushumna. And the idea of some of the practices, and we're going to try 1 or maybe 2, was to unclog the nadis and the chakras, which we'll talk about in a second. These breathing practices like help get the stuff out of them. So kind of like blowing through a straw gets any water that's inside out. Breathing through these particular nadis was supposed to like get the gunk out. It was seen as like a body purification practice. But it was also seen as a way to balance the power between pick a set of opposing forces. Like you can take Ida and Pingala and make a list of 97,000 correspondences for each. 97,000 just means a really big number. So left and right, all right? Now, one of the things that I mentioned when I talked about the caduceus is how the two snakes kind of crisscross over each other. And you can either think of that happening where the chakras are in the body, or you can think of them as being like bicycle chains that just drive consistently up and down. Now, the chakras are another part of yogic anatomy that's not like we expect to be able to dig a hole and find the chakra. The word literally means wheel, and initially the chakras were associated with wheels of gods and goddesses. They were about deities, not about anatomy, like not about the meat suit, okay? Chakra is pronounced with a ch, like church and chucklehead. It is not pronounced with a like shut up, don't say it that way. Yeah? Ch, chakra. I'm picky about this because Sanskrit, sacred language, yada, yada, but also they're different letters. It would be like, deciding one day that you're going to spell Jonathan with a Z at the beginning and you're just going to say, it's Zonathan from now on. Like Jonathan's going to get annoyed by that after a little while. The I want you to take a look at the diagram we've got on the left. I know it's not great quality, but hopefully you can see at least that there are some dots or spots on our man that is swarmed by all these nadis. And if you look in the middle of the man, you can see, okay, there's a big floaty thing above his head, and then maybe like there's kind of a lumpy thing going on at his throat, and then maybe a little further down, maybe mid-chest, there's another, looks like a clump. So in the West, we think of the chakras as being 7 in number, and they correspond to planets and rainbow colors and tones on the musical scale and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, that's all well and good, but we invented that in the West. That didn't come from yoga or from India. The most common chakra system in India uses 6 chakras, and those are only the main chakras with sub-chakras in other parts of the body. So if you look at our model man over here, and you look at where his knees would be, he's kind of sitting with his legs crossed. You'll notice that there's a spot in each of the knees. And if you look at where his ankles are crossed, there's a spot in each of the ankles. And if you look at where his wrists would be, there's a spot in each of the wrists too. And those would also be considered chakras, although they are minor they're minor chakras. They're like the ones in the middle are the big ones, and the ones on the edges are like the little ones, like the little brother chakras. So just to point out, don't get so attached to your 7 chakras as though that has something meaningful or extends to ancient wisdom, because it just doesn't. In fact, we first got all obsessed with 7 chakras when the Serpent Power came out, and Sir John Woodruff wrote about them a little bit, but really it was Charles Ledbetter. And if you look at his book, The Chakras, you'll notice that he doesn't actually have chakras lined up on his diagram. I wish I could steal it. I don't have the book to take it out of, but his chakras are planets. They're not chakras. He's not even trying for anything resembling what he's writing about in India. He immediately associated them with planets and zodiac signs, and we've been attributing, types of chickens and homeopathy and all kinds of stuff to them ever since. Now, sounds crazy, right? Like, oh yeah, there's these 72,000 little rivers in the body that are like doing all this stuff, and of course I need to balance my left nostril and my right nostril, but turns out that noses have erections. There is specialized erectile tissue in your nostrils. And when I say erectile tissue, it is exactly what you are thinking it is. And it exists in your nostrils. Who knew, right? So during the day, yogis used to say that during part of the day, one nostril was dominant, the Ida channel was dominant, and during the other part, the Pingala channel was dominant, which also sounds like crazy talk until you know about nose erections and know that because the erectile tissue alternates which nostril is erect and which is not, it's actually true that your right nostril dominant during part of the day and left nostril dominant during part of the day. So I find this really interesting because even though their explanation for it was bonkers and batshit, we now have science that says, well, they were still right. So like they might have said, oh yeah, 17 minus 12 is 4, which it's not. And we're like, so 4 exists, but it's 2 plus 2, but you got the 4 part right. So the tissues that are shrunken, the non-erect tissue, is where the air passes through more easily. And that changes from left to right during the day. This was discovered by a German nasal specialist in 1895. So it's a relatively recent invention. But I'll note that that was during Crowley's lifetime. So maybe he read about it somewhere, or maybe he didn't. I don't know. I learned about it this week. So if this is news to you, welcome to my club. So let's have another practice. This time, we're going to play with a mudra. So before you close your eyes or get too cozy, you're going to take your hand, right hand, make like Spock. So you have, your live long and prosper. Your 2 ring finger and middle finger go on your nose, and your little finger goes on the left nostril, and your thumb goes on your right nostril. Now, if that feels crazy or your fingers are the wrong length or whatever, your other option is to make like Spock, tuck those 2 fingers in so you're like kind of doing the Hawaiian thing, but with an extra finger, and use those instead. Okay? So either 2 fingers on the nose, 2 fingers on the left nostril, thumb on the right nostril, or tuck them in, 2 fingers on the left nostril, thumb of the right nostril. Okay? So take your comfortable seat, close your eyes, and make your, this is a mudra, it's a seal. Exhale completely. Inhale completely. And then using your thumb to close your right nostril, exhale completely through your left nostril. When you are ready to inhale, inhale completely through your left nostril. And when you're done, block that nostril, open the right nostril, and exhale on the right. Inhale on the right. Close it off with the thumb. Exhale on the left. Inhale on the left. Close it off with the fingers. Repeat, exhale on the right. After your next exhale on the right, drop your hand, let your breathing go back to hanging out in normal time. When you're ready, open your eyes back up. This practice is called alternate nostril breathing in English because we like the fancy names. But it's known in Sanskrit as Nadi Shodhana. Nadi, that's one of those, 72 bajillion channels we were talking about. And Shodhana is the word for clearing or cleansing. So if you think about this as energetic cleansing, because probably you weren't, blowing boogers out during practice, that may make some sense to you. But another way to name this practice is Anuloma Viloma. And Anuloma, Anu means with, and Loma means hair. So this was explained to me as like happy hair, like petting the hair the right way. Like when you pet a cat, there's the happy way to pet the cat, and then there's the like way to pet the cat, right? So V means with, Anu means with, and V means against. And there's a typo in the slide. So it says with hair and with hair. It should be with hair and against hair. So you can also think of that hair as grain. So you're essentially breathing with the grain and against the grain, right? One side, then the other side. The mudra is called Nasarga mudra. I think it might also have the name Vishnu mudra. The mudras usually have several names. I've always been taught you got to do it with your right hand. If you're left-handed, I invite you to try it with your left hand. But the first set of instructions I read said, with your dominant hand. And I was like, I'm going to imagine I'm left-handed. And it was like, okay, with your dominant hand, close the nostril, right nostril with the thumb. I'm like, okay. It's like, and then, put the other two fingers on the, and I was like, I don't think you can do this left-handed and do it the way they're telling me to do it. So if you're going left-handed, I would advise trying it the exact mirror so that you've got the thumb on your left nostril. But if you're right-handed, stick with your right hand. The general progression of this is to first slow your breath down. So you might say inhale for 4, exhale for 6, and then try to double it so that your exhale is 8. So you get inhale 4, exhale 8. You don't have to use a watch or numbers to count. You can also go along with how your body is feeling. And when you've spent enough time practicing where your body is comfortable, you can push it just a little eyelash of hair longer. And like, now I'm at the part where it's comfortable and now it's not comfortable, let's move on. So the idea is not to overstrain when you're trying to increase your capacity, but to add little like grains of sand at a time. That's much easier from, Crowley's idea of like, let's just do it for 30 minutes now. I'm like, no, let's One of the other ways that you can progress this practice is to add that breath retention after every inhale and after every exhale. So inhale, and as you change nostrils, as you inhale, just hold that breath. And then as you exhale, when you're done, hold the breath before you inhale and move back to the other side. There are 2 variations on this. The practical portion of this is that it's supposed to balance the 2 sides of the body, or the two main channels, moving your energy into that Sushumna central channel. If you want to think about this in terms of the Kabbalah, you might think about this as dusting down both of the pillars on the sides so that you can, when you're finished, have that air rise and flow through the middle pillar, which is kind of where you want to be. This is similar to the practice that Crowley described in Liber E, which is why I have Liber E noted over here. And it's also used to cultivate mental stillness and equanimity. If you practice this type of breathing, or really any of these pranayama practices, it does have the potential to change your habitual breathing. So if you have a bad breathing habit, if you tend to mostly chest breathe, or overemphasize the use of your neck muscles to lift or whatever, practicing these steady, even breaths will help you to get rid of that habit. There are 2 variations. I'm almost to the end. I know we're running over time. I'm sorry. There are 2 variations on Nadi Shodhana that are related to using one of the nadis versus the other. So Surya Vedana Pranayama, the word Vedana means piercing, and Surya is the name of the sun god. So you may have heard of sun salutations in modern postural yoga, or Surya Namaskar. Surya, same god. So sun piercing breath is essentially exactly what we just did, except you always inhale on the right and always exhale on the left. Bet you can't guess what moon piercing breath is. It's literally the exact opposite. With the moon piercing breath, Chandra Vedana Pranayama, you will inhale only on the left and exhale only on the right. So the difference is, with Nadi Shodhana, you exhale, then inhale, move to the next nostril, exhale, then inhale. With these variations on the Vedana pranayamas, you will always inhale through the same nostril and always exhale through the same nostril. Now, I have not personally experimented with these a lot, but allegedly, so I have read, the sun piercing breath will help to up your energy and to make you more peppy and, all the things you associate with the sun, whereas the moon piercing breath is more calming and will help you to chillax a little bit before you go to bed. Your mileage may vary, haven't tried it, don't know, can't say. All right, general practice. It applies to everything. I put a cat on it because cats apply to everything. One of the things that Crowley says in in 8 Lectures on Yoga is that the practice and the habit are the thing, right? So traditional pranayama instruction with a teacher, also the #1 recommendation is create regularity. Do a practice every day, even if it's only 2 minutes every day. Even if you only do 5 breaths, do it every day. Practice on a full stomach is not recommended. If you can imagine that Kapalabhati breath with a big burrito sitting in your tummy, bad things happen. Just like Crowley recommends for most magical practices, also recommended for pranayama practice from yoga tradition is that you use the same time, location, clothing, etc., and so forth. Obviously, I feel like some days you just need a different position. Like my knee hurts today, I'm sitting in a different shape. Go for it. I need another pillow today. Today I don't need another pillow. Whatever. Make sure your body's comfortable. I find it fun that traditionally you faced east or north because I can't find out why. But, mostly north and kind of east is where Boleskine House is, right? So that works for me. Traditional seated posture, as I mentioned, has crossed legs to hold the energy into the body circuit symbolically. And soft, slow breath is kind of what you're aiming for in your pranayamas, other than Kapalabhati and those that are intended to have that swift abdominal diaphragmatic action, right? The others are all supposed to be even, slow, tempered. And since your mind and your breath are connected, work on your breath supposedly imprints that work on your mind. Finally, contrary to Crowley, in my least humble opinion and in yoga's historic practice, it is silence and not mantra that is the most profound yoga. So the practice of pranayama that gives you to that moment where everything is still and quiet and you're not thinking a thought and you're just doing the thing, that's where you're trying to go. As a Stalamite, I think we should raise a glass to pranayama. This is a perfectly appropriate method because it inculcates discipline. And one of the things that we teach in Thelema is that self-discipline is the way to make progress. Pranayama literally applies the method of science. You can take any of the yogic pranayamas. Actually, if you put pranayama into the PubMed database, you get a slew of medical research papers on pranayama, which is kind of cool. For example, my number one is that the longer exhale will calm your nervous system. So if you are ever in a situation, even if you're like, can't do pranayama, like whatever, if you can just lengthen your exhale so it's a little bit longer than your inhale, it will have a calming effect on your nervous system. The practice of pranayama to cultivate mental stillness and that equanimity has lots of application. In magical practice, you can use it as a preparation for meditation or for ritual. In regular life, outside of magical practice, it's a really good practice for any situation where you need to be in control of yourself, your thoughts, and your emotions. So if I were going into a Senate confirmation hearing, I would do pranayama before I got quizzed by the Senate committee that was quizzing me. Finally, it can also create space for you to call out to and to listen to your holy guardian angel. Pranayama is another practice to build and maintain energy and to help direct yourself, your body, your nervous system, your brain, your breath, all into doing that one thing, which you will truly to do. I have a couple of reference slides. I'll notice that the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which I mentioned earlier, is attributed to one single author named Sekhet-Maat Oasis. There is an excellent book by Blandine Calais-Germain called The Anatomy of Breathing. Crowley wrote several things on yoga that I've mentioned earlier. One of our brothers, Gordon, whose last name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, wrote a book on India and the occult that is pretty fascinating. Dada Farhi has a book called The Breathing Book. It's from '96, so it's getting a little dated, but it happens. Anya Foxen is the professor who taught me to look at yoga as rigging. Iyengar, Light on Yoga, Light on Pranayama are pretty classic texts. Leslie Kaminoff runs the Breathing Project. He is a very qualified yoga teacher, and he actually teaches a whole course on nothing but breathing, breathing in different kinds of breathing practices. Doug Keller has a book called Refining the Breath, which if you are interested in cultivating a pranayama practice, the number one resource I recommend is his book, Refining the Breath. And the reason is that it is set up so that you can have zero experience, zero knowledge, zero theory. You just start at the beginning and do what he tells you to do. And it starts out with a lot of observation. So that's really useful. The Shiva Samhita translation I used is from James Mallinson, who's a good historian and scholar on the history of yoga. The other recommendation that I have, highly, highly, highly recommend, if you want to start a pranayama practice, is for Richard Rosen's book, The Yoga of Breath. It was one of the first books, other than Iyengar's book, that only wrote about pranayama and that also incorporated modern science and modern research. So it's not just relying on, well, you know, some yogi 10,000 years ago said this thing about nadis and I believe it and now it's settled. Richard presents both the traditional historic teaching, but it's focused on the modern application and practice, and he will walk you through a practice step by step from the beginning, from nothing. And let's see, that's, I think, where I'm going to leave it. So thank you all very much for visiting Sekhet-Maat. I will hang out for a while to take questions after I stop the recording. But if you're not a member of Sekhet-Maat, we would sincerely appreciate your donation in order to help us to build our resources and to make Portland more thelemic. So with that, love is the law, love under will.
Yay, thank you, Mackay.
That was awesome.
Oops. And stop.
Well done. That's great.